Wasteland podcast. This is Eric, aka the Lord Humongous from RuleTheWasteland.com. In case you can't tell, I'm a little bit stuffy, so if I break into a giant snarfing or sneezing fit during the podcast, just bear with me. Got some kind of a seasonal stuffiness going on. Don't feel too bad, luckily, but it is making me sound a little weird and a little coughy sometimes. What I wanted to talk about today is freedom and rights, because there's a lot of weird ideas going out around today in our society about what freedom is really about and what rights really are. And so I wanted to give you my opinion about how these things should be viewed and how they really are. And you can let me know what you guys think about the topic as well. So first of all, when I'm speaking of freedom, I'm talking about an ideological sense of freedom. I'm not talking about physical lack of freedom. So when I say you have the freedom to do something, I'm going with the definition of a lack of outside restraint in a choiceful manner by other people, not necessarily in an environmental sense. So, you know, if Aaron Ralston, the guy who wrote Between a Rock and a Hard Place, when he was trapped in the by the boulder in the canyon or whatever in Utah, that's not what I'm talking about. In that sense, I would say he had just as much freedoms as you or I did at any other point in our life, because I'm not referring to your physical opportunities based on your physical abilities or your geopolitical positioning or your, whatever may be stopping you at that moment. So he had the same freedoms that we do in that sense. So that's what I mean. So don't get confused when I'm talking about ideological freedoms versus something physically blocking that has nothing to do with another human being. So in that sense, like Cro-Magnon people or cavemen had more freedom of travel than we do, even though they didn't have the same ability to jump in a plane and, fly across the world. So in that sense, there was no other person or no other political or ideological entity that was seeking to restrain them. There were physical limitations, on their travel, just based on their environment and their abilities and their technology, but that has nothing to do with the type of freedom that I'm talking about. So in that sense, they had more freedoms. They had much more freedom than we did. The only freedoms that they may have had taken from them would have been imposed by other people, maybe people in their tribe or whatever rules they came up with. But traveling wasn't one of them, because there were no geopolitical boundaries, there were no visas, you didn't have to get permission, and that sort of thing. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about freedom. So anything that basically, an easy way for me to describe it, rights and freedom, and this is how I usually do it to describe it to other people when I'm trying to explain where I'm coming from with my view of freedom and rights, is I say, if you were alone on this planet, anything you could do is a right or a freedom. Anything you could do without physical restraint from another person, or coercion or threats of violence or whatever from another entity, that would be freedom. So you're not always going to be able to do the things that you would want. We have the absolute freedom to travel, to space travel right now, for the most part, but we just don't have the ability to do that. So that's where I'm coming from with that. And that also gives you a good idea on what rights are, because people nowadays refer to things as healthcare, jobs, education as rights. And that shows you how kind of skewed a view that they have of these. Because if you go and you say, hey, I'm alone in the universe, you have a right to knowledge, to whatever knowledge you can collect, but you don't have a right to an education. Because let's look at what education is. When you talk about an education, you're talking about books, you're talking about schools, classrooms, teachers, someone physically presenting you with this knowledge. So you're talking about human labor and physical infrastructure and physical goods. So if you're saying I have a right to an education, you're claiming that you have a right, just by existing, to other people's time, other people's labor, and physical assets that belong to other people or just exist on the earth. You're saying that you have a right to that, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And same thing with healthcare. What is healthcare? Healthcare is a hospital, it's a doctor, it's medicine, it's procedures, labor done by other people. So for you to say I have a right to healthcare, you're literally saying I have a right to other people's time, labor, and resources, which some people believe that. I certainly don't. But if you're going to make that claim, at least know what you're claiming. Don't just say I have a right to have healthcare without realizing that you're claiming a right of ownership over other people's hours of their life and their belongings and their, infrastructure. So when you say I have a right to healthcare, a right to education or right to a job, you're literally saying you have a right to other people's time and how they spend their day, which is slavery. You're saying that these people should be your slaves because these things are owed to you by the universe, which is absolutely ridiculous. And at the same time, people who claim that we have freedom of speech and things like that, people like to say that there's freedom of speech exists in the U.S. So yeah, it's freedom of speech. You just can't say things that, whatever. You can't say this. You can't you can't cry fire in a crowded movie theater. Well, that's not freedom of speech. If you say I have a freedom to say everything but whatever, it doesn't matter what comes after the but, you don't have freedom of speech. You have limited speech. Now, it may be very slightly limited. It may only be limited a little bit, but it's still limited. And if it is limited at all, then you don't have freedom of speech. So for me, freedom of speech would be anything that I could say without reprisal, without threat of violence or coercion when I was alone in the universe. You know, anything I could say. Then you have freedom of speech because you can literally say whatever you want. We certainly do not have that now. There's a lot of things that you can get criminal charges for saying and get arrested for saying, or certainly have negative consequences for saying. And before I go any further, I do want to point out that I'm not talking about negative consequences specifically, because there's a lot of things that you have a right to do and have the freedom to do, which could still bring negative consequences. So freedom doesn't mean freedom from negative consequences, because just, again, if you're alone in the universe, you have the freedom to do whatever you want. Many of those choices could have grave negative consequences for you and for your life. It may even cause you to die. But that doesn't mean that makes it not freedom, you know what I mean? It just means that it would be a stupid decision to use that particular freedom. You know, you have the freedom to jump into the jaws of an alligator in that situation, but it would have negative consequences. So other people's freedom sometimes will cause negative consequences to happen to you as well after you exercise yours, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the infrastructural or basically monopoly on violence being used against you, the government's monopoly on violence being used against you to actively stop you from participating in whatever this thing is. That would be an infringement on your freedom. So when they're saying you can't, and a lot of people disagree with the things that I'm saying, I take a very, very liberal approach to my view of freedom. And I'm not talking about liberal in the leftist sense, but liberal in the actual definition of the word, which means to allow. So I think that unless something causes direct physical harm to another human being, no one else should have a say in whether you do it or not. So anything that comes out of your mouth, simply the act of saying it, should not be illegal. I don't think there's absolutely anything you should be allowed to just utter syllables for that should be a justification for someone using physical force against you. And a lot of people disagree with that. A lot of people think that if it's hate speech or if you're crying fire in a crowded movie theater or whatever, then that should be illegal. But there's a very easy way to tell the difference, and I believe in the initiation of, or the non-aggression principles, means that the initiation of violence is the wrong part, not necessarily use of violence in any situation, but whoever initiates it. So if you were, and there has to actually be physical damages to an injured party for there to have been a crime committed. That's how I view things. So if you're in a crowded movie theater and you say, "Fire, fire!" and everyone's like, "Shut the fuck up, we're trying to watch a movie here." There was no injury there, really. And you should be allowed to do that. And then if the owner of the theater wants to kick you out, then that's, their right, their prerogative as a business owner. Now, if you cry fire in a crowded theater and it starts a stampede and someone's infant child gets trampled on the way out of this stampede, and they can say, "Hey, this was directly related to this guy yelling that," then you should be somewhat liable for damages. They should be able to sue you, or there should be criminal charges there for whatever the damage is. But that's not to say that the actual words are what should be illegal. It's the fact that you cause damage, because those damages could be caused by saying a lot of other things too. So instead of trying to control the speech, you just punish what the actual damage or injury that is caused. And that's where law has gone awry in a lot of modern senses, is that they try to head these things off to make everyone feel secure and everything. So they make a lot of things illegal that aren't actually causing injury or anything to anyone, and just to try and act like they're doing something, or make people feel safer, instead of actually just, actually letting you commit a crime before they punish you. They make everything else a crime. So one example, and this is another one a lot of people disagree with, but like driving drunk. The act of being over a certain percent threshold of blood alcohol level does not automatically cause an injury to another human being, and thus I don't think you should that should be something that can be illegal, because you're not actually causing injury. Now, if you cause injury by smashing into somebody, it doesn't really matter why you did it. You know what I mean? If you did it on purpose, if it did an accident, if you did it because you were tired, because you were drunk, the injury has been caused, and you need to deal with that when it happens and not try to head it off, because then they just keep backing up the line and infringing on more freedom. See, now you can't have this other blood alcohol level. Okay, now you can't drink while you're driving, even if you're under that blood alcohol level. Now you can't even have anyone else in the vehicle drinking while you're driving, even if you haven't had even if you're not holding it. Now you can't even have the empty container from anyone else drinking in your vehicle. So all these things that are becoming illegal that don't actually address the fact that there's a physical injury has occurred to other people, and just creates criminals out of and crimes out of these situations where there's no damage being done to anyone. And a lot of people just have the, well, if it saves one life policy, then it's worth it. And they're like, that may be your philosophy, but then you're literally claiming the right to control other people's behavior and lives, and actually use physical force to do so. Because remember, this is a very important point that a lot of people gloss over. Every time you make a law, no matter what the law is, whether it's a jaywalking law or the height of your lawn, you know what it needs to be, and that's a law, you are backing that up with a threat of death. Because when it comes down to it, and physical violence at the very least, and certainly death is a possibility, the only ability and authority that the government has to enforce a law, any law, is their monopoly on violence. So they can impose penalties and fines and whatever, but there's nothing that compels anyone to pay those or to actually give up any of their resources, except for the fact that they can, if it comes down to it, they can physically come kidnap you and put you in a cage, beat you, kill you if you resist, whatever. So anytime you have to understand that anytime you support any law, you're basically supporting the death penalty as a last resort for that law. Doesn't matter if it's a ordinance for open containers, or for the height of the grass in your city, or whether you can have chickens or not. You're basically saying, when it comes down to it, this is important enough for someone to be killed over if they completely refuse to obey, which I think is absolutely ridiculous if it's not something that can result in injury to another person. And I'm not talking about injury like they don't dislike it, but measurable harm to someone. So that's just something to think about. This is going to be a relatively short podcast. I've kind of been rambling a little bit, but when someone asks you about freedom and what is freedom, what are rights, that's my view on the matter. So when someone says healthcare is a right, or we have freedom of speech in this country, now you've got a little something that you can tell them about, if you agree with me, that is, about why that's not necessarily the case. And I'd like, if you guys have some different opinions about what is freedom and what are rights, then please let me know in the comments. And another thing that a mistake that people make is they rely on our current system of government, i.e. the Constitution, as a source of authority for their freedom and their rights, which is kind of ridiculous because it's only a few hundred years old and it's not perfect, and it's still a non-voluntary system of government. So to rely on that as your basis for your natural rights as a human being and just freedom in general, and for why you don't think physical violence should be used or initiated against you for no reason, I think just pointing to something that someone came up 200 years ago and saying this is why is not a very good reason. And that's not why. I mean, I think human freedom and human rights existed before the Constitution. And just like Ted Nugent once said, he doesn't need a piece of paper to tell him that he has the right to defend himself and his family. So I think these things are natural rights and are not granted to us by the Constitution. That's another thing people don't understand, is the Constitution doesn't grant rights. It imposes limits on the government. The rights are natural. They already existed. And the Constitution is there to limit government in an attempt to keep them from infringing on those natural rights. And it's done about as good as a job as any other system of government, of non-voluntary government, has ever done. But it's not perfect, and it's not the source of the rights themselves. So keep that in mind, and let me know your guys' thoughts on what you consider to be rights and what you consider to be freedoms. And I will talk to you guys later. Appreciate you guys listening.